If you want to save yourself six figures, listen up because I've made every boneheaded mistake in commercial leasing of my own properties, every one you can possibly imagine. And some of these mistakes didn't hurt for a month or a year. They haunted me for years afterwards. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the biggest screw ups that I've made and mistakes around personal guarantees with commercial tenants, tenant improvements, and one mistake that almost cost me a unicorn tenant that added millions of dollars to my asset, but I protected myself from using this one tactic in commercial leasing. And most landlords have never even heard of this one. So before I go into that, my name is Nat Druin. I am a commercial real estate investor. I've been an investor for 19 years. I started in small multifamily properties. I started with a 4-unit multifamily that I owner occupied back in 2006. During the first 11 years of my real estate investing career, I focused on small multifamily. And then in 2019, I started getting involved with buying commercial properties. And the reason why I did that was because of the amount of upside that you can create when you're buying commercial asset classes like retail, industrial, and even office. Back a couple of years ago, we bought a 50,000 square foot high-rise government office building. It had 8,000 square feet of vacancy in the building, and we leased up to 8,000 square feet of space. We bought the building for $2.75 million. And once we inked that lease with that tenant, we signed a 15-year lease, and the building value went from $2.75 million to an appraised value of $4.6 million, which allowed us to refinance the properties, pay our investors back their $750,000 in cash they put into this deal to help us take it down, and also we were able to put about $300,000 in our pocket tax-free. But I'm only able to celebrate successes like that because of all of the mistakes that I've made. And this comes to leasing, right? When you are buying smaller commercial properties, even if you have a broker that's helping you, the broker is not tied to your long-term success in the building. Remember how they get compensated. They get compensated when they bring a ready, willing, and able tenant to your building that's going to lease space, and then they earn their commission, which in some cases can be anywhere between 4% and 7% of the total economic value of that long-term lease onto you. And then at that point in time, they're done. You're the one that's going to actually be inheriting the risk. And don't listen to the broker on their advice on how to structure leases and what to ask for, because they don't have an alignment of interest. And to be honest with you, most of them don't have the experience of actually being a property owner. Okay, so stick with me because there are these kinds of lessons I'm going to cover below. Nobody tells you, and certainly brokers aren't going to tell you. And as sure as hell, I didn't learn them from a book. I learned them from the school of hard knocks. All right, the first mistake is not getting personal guarantees with your prospective tenants. And what is a personal guarantee? It's not only their LLC or corporation that is signing the lease. You want to make sure that you're getting a personal guarantee from an actual operator, the actual tenant itself, either from the principal or the co-principals or co-founders in the company. Now, there is some caveats here. Don't expect that Howard Schultz, CEO of Starbucks, I don't even know if he's the CEO of Starbucks anymore, that he's going to sign personally on your leases. Like, they don't do that. So don't expect to receive personal guarantees on the performance of the lease from really large companies. But most of you out there that are curious about alternative commercial real estate asset classes, you're typically going to be leasing to mom and pops, okay? And these are going to be, startup businesses or businesses that are expanding. So the one mistake that I did make is that I had somebody that was adamant about not signing a personal guarantee. This was a small mom and pop dog grooming business. And I was like, okay, all right. And some of the mistakes that I made is that I paid for some of the build out. So it was about $50,000 in cash that came out of my pocket. They opened up for business. It wasn't in a great location for them. They weren't able to produce enough revenue to pay rent, and they ended up walking away from the space. So when I brought the lease to my attorney to go forward with collections, we discovered that they had no other assets in this LLC that they signed a lease on. So basically, they were able to walk away scot-free with me having $50,000 to spend costs and also all the vacancy and collection loss that I endured through that. So you want to make sure that there's some sort of skin in the game. If you cannot get a personal guarantee, making a review of, okay, is this a long-term operator? Do they have a lot of assets that the business owns? And all of those things, all right? And if you can't get a guarantee, getting an additional deposit, okay, more than 1 month's rent, prepaid rent, for instance, if let's say 3 to 6 months of prepaid rent or some sort of line of credit from a bank, all right? Number 2, all right, is a lot of times when you are leasing vacant space, especially if it's an as-is condition, a tenant is typically going to ask sometimes for free rent. All right, so this is like, hey, I want to have 3 months, 4 months, 6 months of free rent so I can take the space, get my architect involved, build it out, and then when I open up for business, then I'll start paying rent at that point in time. I love free rent, right? Because I can give 3 months worth of free rent that might be equivalent to like $7,500. And I know that tenant is putting $50, $60, $70, $100,000 into that space and improving it. So I'm more than willing to do that. But the one thing you want to be clear on is that the mistake that I made in the past was having it tied to some sort of thing that wasn't a specific date on a calendar, meaning that, oh, we want 3 months of free rent, or we don't want rent to commence until we get a certificate of occupancy on the property, or when we open for business is when the free rent period commences. Now, when you have this type of contingency in there that benefits the tenant, I've had tenants before that they couldn't get their certificate of occupancy in time. The city was throwing curveballs their way in terms of code requirements and all these other things, zoning and all of that stuff. And it was 6, 8, 10 months went by and they didn't get this thing. And then I was basically stuck holding the bag with all the holding costs, all the debt service in the property. So now what I do to avoid this mistake is that I make it predefined, right? The free rent period starts when you get possession of the space, right? whether that's 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, whatever it may be, right? And then after that, it doesn't matter whether you're open for business or not. That tenant then knows, hey, we have a certain amount of time. It's set in stone. There's no wiggle room on this whole thing. If we endure zoning challenges or build out challenges, or if our contractor steals a bunch of money from us, then we still are going to have to pay rent. All right. So this creates urgency and removes misaligned incentives. Mistake number 3 is misunderstanding lease renewal options. When I used to lease my own space, I would be thrilled at the prospect of, oh, hey, Matt, we want to lease your 5,000 square feet of space for 5 years, and then we want to have 2 5-year renewal options. And what that meant to me and my own experienced brain, and also brokers will do this to you as well, is like, oh my gosh, they want the space for like 15 years. The thing is that lease renewal options are only to the benefit of the tenant. The cards are completely theirs. So to you, it's a 5-year lease. To them, it's a maximum 15-year lease. And the reason why tenants typically want to have renewal options is because they may not want to sign a 10-year lease, but they want the option to renew, for instance, for an additional 5 years, especially if they're putting a ton of money into the actual space itself. A lot of times where this is going to be non-negotiable, for instance, is that if they're putting, let's say, $200,000 into the space and they're getting financing from a bank, the bank is not going to lend them that money if they're not protected by a lease that gives them renewal options, for instance, for another 5 or 10 years after the first negotiated lease term. I always like to reduce the amount of options or eliminate them altogether. Sometimes it might be a sticking point in lease negotiations, but just know they are not to your benefit. And the nightmare scenarios that I've had in the past is that I've had tenants that had renewal options that were basically holding me hostage up until their right to renew the lease, for instance. So if you are going to have renewal options, make sure that tenant's lease option expires, let's say 6 to 12 months before their existing term is up. Meaning that if they don't specifically exercise their option to renew it in writing 12 months before the current term expires, then that lease option disappears and they no longer have that option. So then what you can do is you yourself or your broker can go on and trying to relet the space or release the space before their lease term is up. Okay. So this also gives them an additional feet to the fire to pretty much shit or get off the pot, right? So you don't want to have this being where the lease option is open-ended to the end of the term or even 3 months, because your tenants don't have any incentive to exercise that option any earlier. Mistake number 4 is issuing tenant improvement allowances too early. Now, what is a tenant improvement allowance? This is basically where a tenant says, hey, we'll take the space as is, we'll build it out with our own dollars, but we want to have you contribute $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 to the actual build out to help us out. All right. This is a concession that is very prevalent in, like, let's say retail, office, and industrial, a lot in retail. The reason why they do this is because sometimes they're getting a loan to help them build the space out, and the bank, they're not going to fund the entire build out. So they're going to ask the landlord to do that. Before I get into negotiating tenant improvements, especially with mom and pops, right, because they have a high failure rate, much higher than, like, let's say regional and national tenants, is that I would rather negotiate a free rent period rather than tenant improvements. Okay. So there was actually a tenant that we had that is still existing to this day, almost like 6-7 years later, going strong. And they wanted us to contribute tenant improvement dollars. What we did instead is we just gave them 6 months of free rent, okay, that commenced on the date that they took possession of that space, all right? So if you have to pay tenant improvements, make sure to be specific on the timing of those. The mistake that I made is that I had a tenant that came in and they wanted the tenant improvements up front, right? They signed a long-term lease. They're a great operator. They're opening up a second location. And so I gave them wrote them a check when they took possession of around $40,000 to help them with their build out. Well, what happened is they got taken advantage of by their contractor. They ended up burning through that money. And then the space was half demolished. The space was totally messed up. They were out of money and they ended up walking. Okay. So I was left with a space that was worse off than when I had actually gave it to them. All right. Major bummer, right? Because I had a space that was actually like, it was showable. It was in decent shape. And now it was there was garbage all over the place. It was half demolished and all of those things. So what I do now is if we're going to have tenant improvement dollars, I only give the tenant improvement dollars awarded to the tenant when they have a certificate of occupancy, an unconditional certificate of occupancy, and also they're open for business. All right. So this front loads the amount of money they have to put into the space to get it going. And then I pay them on completion. So if it doesn't get completed, then I don't pay them. All right. So then I can help mitigate my losses in the event that I have a tenant or a prospective tenant that goes belly up. Now, mistake or opportunity, I'd say number 5 is using relocation language in your leases. Now, this is probably not going to apply to industrial or retail spaces, all right? Because those are very location sensitive, especially retail, right? If they're on the corner of Main Street and Main Street, that location is strategic to them. But in office, for instance, especially when you have many floors, always having relocation language in your leases and also your lease renewals if you're inheriting a tenant. And by using this strategy, this is what allowed me to actually land a tenant that added millions of dollars worth of value to the property we bought. All right. If we didn't have this, that opportunity would have been completely not possible. Okay. So this is what happened is we owned a multi-story office building. There's some floors that were 50% occupied, some that were 75% occupied, but they were kind of staggered throughout the actual stacking plan. And I had a broker that came to me and said, hey, we have a 10,000 square foot need for a regional medical operator that needs space on the first floor of a building with all these other criteria and that sort of thing. And so When you actually have relocation language with all of your tenants in an office building, for instance, that means that that entire building is pretty much available, right? Because if you find another tenant that wants to take an entire floor and you have tenants that are in there, they're only occupying 50% of the floor, then you could reconfigure those and restack those tenants and consolidate tenants in favor of landing that larger tenant. So what we ended up doing is we ended up exercising that relocation language. We took the tenants who were occupying 50% of the first floor and ended up moving them to the upper floors. So we actually ended up strengthening the rent roll and also getting a great long-term tenant in place. And the financial benefit to this whole thing is that one lease deal added $100,000 in cash flow to the actual deal and added millions of dollars in valuation to that property. And this would have been impossible without the relocation clause that we had built into all those leases. So how relocation language works is that the landlord has the right to relocate a tenant to a comparable space, right? And you typically must cover the moving expenses, cover a reasonable build out for the new space. We even have language in our leases that we pay for, new business cards, a new letterhead, and all those things, and to make the actual move as seamless as possible. So make sure to use these tips. And if there's tips that I missed in this, definitely drop them in the comments below. And the one thing is that when you are residential going to actual commercial uses, the biggest risk you can have on residential is you rent to one bad tenant or you structure a lease the wrong way. You're basically just, you're hurting yourself for a year. But we're talking about commercial leasing that can be anywhere between 3, 5, 10, 15-year leases, which you negotiate now can either help you tremendously in the future or get your property stuck forever. So make sure that you're very careful and don't be flippant or casual about structuring your leases on commercial spaces. I hope this helps you avoid the mistakes that I made. Commercial leasing has incredible upside. Don't let this video scare you. We don't even do residential multifamily anymore. We're strictly on actual commercial asset classes because of the amount of upside and also the fact that I feel like I have a partner and a tenant, right? Not that a tenant is actually just using me to lay their head in a pillow for a year or so. So it feels more like a partnership. The management intensity of commercial is significantly less than multifamily. Typically with commercial, tenants are taking care of everything that's inside their box. So if they have an overflowing toilet or whatever, or a broken door, that's their responsibility, not mine as the property owner. And my last words of advice is that if you are looking for any advice or direction, I am an open book. Even if you are not going to become a prospective client of mine in the Go Bigger Sooner program, reach out to me. I'm always happy to get on a Zoom call and talk you through it and demystify and also give you encouragement and confidence in whatever direction you're going to go, whether you're going to hire me or not as your advisor. But if you are serious about getting hand in glove help, right, from a battle-hardened real estate investor like myself and my partner Vlad, who's also a real estate investor of 25 years and has a portfolio even bigger than mine, definitely, if you are interested in us helping you land your first big deal that's going to add $500,000 to your net worth and $50,000 a year in annual cash flow in 12 months or less, guaranteed, or you don't pay, meaning that we refund our entire fee you paid for us to get us on your team for an entire year, risk-free, no questions asked, make sure to book in a call below. We'd be happy to talk to you. 80% of the people we get in these sales calls with is not a good fit for us, right? But our whole philosophy is that we always want to leave people better or anything better than the way we found them. So at the very least, I guarantee you'll get a tremendous amount of value out of talking to myself and Vlad. And so make sure to check that out. And I cannot help anybody that unless you own 5 or more residential properties. I only work with experienced real estate investors, not newbies. I cannot help newbies. So if you are still trying to figure out how to get into this real estate industry and you haven't done a deal before, I have a ton of content on my YouTube channel to check out everywhere from how to find off-market deals, how to raise capital, how to analyze properties, what things to look out for like we covered in this video. So make sure to subscribe and check out all of the hundreds of hours of content that I have on my channel. Thanks.